Jim, thank you so much for doing it. It will present on the U.S.-China security relations with a fuller title up there in the slides. You have an hour. Usual rules, half an hour and then Q&A.
Okay, thanks very much, and thanks for asking me to be here. I've learned a ton. It's not really my main thing. What you're going to see now is quite different. As you'll see, I'm not an economist. I don't know. I'll be interested to see what you guys think the connections are to this thing called geoeconomics. I'm working that out. I've learned a lot so far. You'll see that it's more conjectural. There's no quantitative data in this one. And interested to see what you think about that. Also, it's based on a longer talk I've been giving, although a somewhat different version. The pacing may be off. I'm going to try to go fast, but I really don't know if I'm going to be, pressing up against the time or we're way too short. So we'll see. So, okay, so an attempt at a little bit of connection to this thing called geoeconomics. So the interest I gather is and plausibly driven by a return in some part to return of major power conflict. The examples there have been, we've seen them in other slides so far as well. I'm guessing that, to understand the geoeconomic environment, you need to understand the geopolitical environment. And I'd argue, and, a lot going on in this talk, is that to understand the geopolitical environment, you need to understand the military state of play and how it's evolving. So in the post-Cold War period, a very standard view in my field, international relations, both here and especially in Europe, was that major power military conflict was simply a thing of the past. It was an anachronism. Many people I know, myself included, were told, why are you bothering to study this stuff? It's gone, or essentially gone. And and from that perspective, what we're seeing should be surprising and puzzling. And I actually have sympathy for this view. It should be surprising and puzzling for two main reasons, I'd say. We live in a nuclear era. More on that in a second. And high levels of economic interdependence. So what's going on? You've probably almost surely heard about Allison's Thucydides trap ideas and somewhat related but a little bit different, but also popularized versions from John Mearsheimer say basically you guys were, the U.S. government especially was subject to liberal delusional thinking, and that really they forgot about realism, and it's the same old realist story of a power transition, or what John calls the tragedy of great power politics. I think, happy to go into this more, but really quickly, I think their arguments really don't work as they're put. To focus in particular on U.S. and China, they have no territorial disputes, no common border. They're very, very far apart. A major war would be a catastrophe, including damage to their homelands, including in the form potentially of nuclear escalation, but there's a lot of other ways they can cause damage to homelands now too. Neither can plausibly invade the other, and that's very robust to changes in relative power, economic power, and so on. Again, for a bunch of reasons, but including nuclear weapons. And in a nuclear world, states really don't need allies in the same way that they did in the conventional world. And one example there would be North Korea, a tiny little state that would be utterly helpless against China or the US, or pretty much South Korea in a non-nuclear world, doesn't even really need a major power protector in the nuclear world, or needs it certainly far, far less. In general, large-scale territorial conquest of the sort we saw, for example, in World War II, much harder to imagine in a nuclear world, where big states, even if they don't have them now, can get nuclear weapons, typically, if they're sufficiently threatened. And, a place that I would suspect we're headed towards more. Okay, so what exactly do the US and China have to worry about in the realm of military security with respect to each other? Why can't they just take advantage of very large joint gains, both in trade and other areas, by trading happily? Maybe there are these kind of typical frictions that the trade economists like to look into, but manageable. and not be so concerned about actual or potential shifts in relative economic and military capabilities. How can there be a Thucydides trap if it's become extremely difficult to convert economic might into large-scale territorial conquest? So I'm going to try to sketch a longer argument in reply to this question. I'm flagging now that some aspects of it may be changing with Trump too. I'm not sure. Even if they do, you could think of it as an attempt to explain how we got where we are now. So the kind of at an abstract or somewhat abstract high level, the idea is that, and this is not new, but has long been the case, that major and middle powers have sharp conflicts of interest that I'm going to argue often, or generally, have often not had anything really to do with their national security in the strict sense. That is to say, they have conflicts that make them revisionists. They want to change the status quo for reasons that are not about security in the sense of like keeping what you have, and in particular, territorial integrity within current borders. So in a longer talk, I'd sketch this out more, but basically saying that both now and I'd say for a long time, the kind of typical path to military conflict has been you have states that are revisionist on some matters of security, not about security per se. That gives them incentives to arm up, the better to bargain, coerce, deter on these conflicts of interest. And that then the arming up and frictions associated with that generates in some situations preventive war or preventive war risks that come from changes in or perceptions and change in relative power from arming. So I'm going to argue that this basic sketch with some details, I'm going to focus on China-US, but in the longer version, I talk about Russia-Ukraine and can talk about North Korea, South Korea, US, Iran, Israel, US, and other cases. The details, what are they? So what are and currently, what are these revisionist non-security based conflicts of interest? And then second, what exactly are these preventive war risks and where are they coming from? Okay, so what are the non-security based conflicts of interest? So I'm going to say these days, two main sources. First, democracies are intrinsically threatening to dictatorships. Democracies have typically preferred, even if they haven't like actively sought it, they'd prefer to see autocracies transition to democracy, and vice versa. Dictatorships, other things equal, like to see democracies go away. This is particularly problematic when the democracy is very, very militarily strong, the US in the post-Cold War period, and so might be tempted to support the opposition in a domestic uprising and a dictatorship. I'll talk about this more, but this is, think color revolutions. Okay, so that's one thing. That's one source of non-security-based revisionist preferences. Second, conflicting nationalist claims on territory. So, main example in the case at hand, PRC nationalist claims on ownership of Taiwan versus Taiwanese preference to be an independent nation separate from the PRC. So these are partly instrumental, I'm going to argue, for that autocratic leaders use, and actually democratic leaders sometimes use for legitimation and public support, but often that's based on the fact that both they and their publics are just generally, it's not just instrumental, it's genuine. Okay, so logic of democracy, autocracy conflict. So I'm going to claim that autocratic regimes and leaders are almost always extremely insecure and worry a lot about domestic rebellion and coups. And this is true even in a country like China, where the CCP is very, very powerful, and Xi Jinping appears to be very, very powerful. Note how often he engages in purges and so on, and have no obvious domestic contenders, no strong opposition parties, or other regime security threats. Over the last 25 years, 30 years, we've seen technological change in the form of the internet, information technology revolutions that greatly facilitate or can greatly facilitate coordination in opposition to a government, an authoritarian regime in particular. This has greatly complicated the regime security problem of autocrats, and they have driven them to innovate and spend in substantial and interesting ways. So, for example, the CCP has developed this unbelievably vast surveillance state, which they are increasingly exporting. They, by the way, one of the concerns of autocrats in this new technologically enabled world is that they have to worry a lot more about opponents who are living in another country but can use the internet to undermine them. And they reach out and try to do things about that. A second part of this, I think, and part of the response, Benedict Anderson has a wonderful chapter in a famous book he called it Official Nationalism, which was about how in response to the spread of liberalism and the threat of liberalism in 19th century Europe, but also with cases ever since, autocrats have had to come up with ways to legitimate, justify their rule in a democratic age. And official nationalism is one way to go at it, is to say, I, the king, am the embodiment of the nation, and my justification to rule is that I represent you, the nation. To oppose me is to be a tool of foreign powers working against the nation. I see that President Trump just accused the Supreme Court of being a tool of foreign powers, or at least some people on the court. I think this is something where I'd like to collect data. It's my impression that we have increasingly seen authoritarians in the last 30 years invoking nationalist legacies and turning to nationalist legitimation in a whole bunch of places. Further, I think part of this is like democracies are intrinsically threatening to autocracies by providing, a threatening alternative script. But the post-Cold War period also saw the US and the EU doing a whole bunch of things that you can understand why they would genuinely alarm and create a threat perception or increase a threat perception by autocrats. So US and ally and partner military interventions, I won't list them all, you're familiar with them. They did a whole bunch of lower level military operations in the same general vein. Lots of money flowed into NGOs and IGOs and multi and bilateral aid projects for democracy promotion. The Arab Spring uprisings were extremely concerning in China and Russia, as far as I can tell. These weren't caused by the US or the EU, but they were often supported in various degrees after the fact. And then there's the color revolutions, of which there were a lot, mainly failed, but nonetheless extremely alarming and concerning to autocrats. And Putin and Xi Jinping both appear to believe. I think the evidence on Putin's pretty good. I don't know about Xi Jinping, but genuinely believe that the U.S. was behind this in many cases. Okay, so autocrats correctly infer that the U.S. would be perfectly happy if they were overthrown. They believe, and they've got a lot of evidence, that the U.S. and its friends may actively help or support domestic opposition should another Tiananmen, say, get going. Even some of our favored friendly autocrats get worried. Erdogan in Turkey and Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia at times. From their perspective, the U.S. and its allies and partners were the revisionists, or have been the revisionists about their regime type, not about their territory. So not the kind of classic international security, territorial integrity concern. And as I mentioned, I think that's partly a matter of U.S., EU, et cetera, post-Cold War policies, but it's also partly intrinsic. Hard to sort them out. So I don't know how much, but part I think of the return of major power conflict and geoeconomics is partly downstream of a developing autocratic reaction to technological changes and US-EU democratic expansionism and pressures in the post-Cold War period. Now, here's where, maybe this is changing. Trump and the Republican Party are moving the US in a decidedly authoritarian direction, towards an authoritarian regime. That could reduce the sense of, it may reduce the sense of threat to autocracies while increasing, we can see it increasing the sense of threat to Denmark, for example, and so on. My own guess is that, clearly Xi and Putin are very plausibly they're thrilled, right? But they're probably, I doubt they'd be completely confident and reassured. They see Donald Trump knocking off, kidnapping an authoritarian in Venezuela and perhaps on the verge of another regime change operation, a much bigger one in the Middle East. And you'd also wonder if the US could swing back at some point. So you wouldn't want to, you'd want to get everything you can from Trump but not count on a permanent change. But I don't know. But in any event, I think the analysis, or I hope it helps explain how we got here. And I also, from a more within poli-sci IR perspective, think it does better than other like realist in particular contenders. Okay, so back on the logic of democracy and autocracy conflict, you can think of this underlying revisionist preference by the democracies, the strong democracies, creating a commitment problem. They can't credibly commit not to support a domestic uprising against an autocrat, up to and including forms of military support. That's a picture from Libya in 2011. That was truly an object lesson for the North Koreans, for Putin. Very dramatic. Gaddafi had tried to make a deal. Had made a deal. There's an uprising, and then okay, we're just going to support them to get you thrown out and killed. Iran now would be another object lesson where U.S. makes a deal with them, Trump tears it up, and is now going to try to, or has tried to change the regime, facilitate in support of domestic. All right, so if you're a small country, if you're a small, weak autocracy like North Korea or Iran, this is, what do you take away from this? Well, one of the main things is that it would be really great to have nuclear weapons. And North Korea has, succeeded at that, obviously. What about for the major powers? Well, for Russia and China, who have nuclear weapons and are much bigger and have big armies, it has produced a whole set of policies, both domestic and foreign policies, intended to address autocratic regime insecurity in this, in this technological and political environment. What do we see for Putin? Campaigns of misinformation, disinformation, promotion of extremist positions and groups, electoral influence attempts in democracies that are perceived as threats. At home, an emphasis on Russian ethnic nationalism and kind of all Russian, pan-Slavic or pan-Russian concepts, and a focus on a military buildup. Russia as a great power. So Russia as a great, this is back to the kind of official nationalism. Part of that is we are a big, strong, great power, and you should support me because I am cultivating, developing, ensuring that status. Okay, in China, even before Xi Jinping, you have this broad, deep crackdown on expression, a great firewall, huge expansion of state surveillance and control of individuals or potential to control them. Efforts to project this control to Chinese descended people or Chinese citizens outside China. You see Xi Jinping relying pretty heavily on nationalist language, a lot of emphasis on the century of humiliation, achieving the great dream being the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and a major, major military buildup. again, I think, well, for one major reason I'll turn to in a minute, Taiwan, but also for some of this kind of autocratic legitimation strategy. So I talked about democracies and dictatorships. Let me say a little tiny bit now about nationalist claims, nationalism. So for Putin and Xi, it's not just instrumental. It appears to be, as best we can tell, sincere also, and in accord with the views of many Russians and Chinese. I won't go through this to save time, but the evidence on the kind of genuine nationalism about Taiwan, at least from the party, from its inception, is really strong. Can say similar things, and we have, I guess, in some ways more direct evidence about Putin's thinking here. So, as I mentioned, yeah, selling an idea of great power status to the domestic public is an autocratic regime security strategy, but it's also genuine, which is part of why it works, I guess. Okay, so coming back to how do you get to war risk and military security conflict? Talk a little bit about how that path works in the case of U.S.-China. The conflict of interest, well, I just mentioned the nationalist claims on Taiwan, seen as critical for long-run legitimacy and success of the Chinese Communist Party regime. Xi Jinping and some leaders before him have been threatened by a prosperous democratic Hong Kong was threatening in this regard, and likewise Taiwan it's the same. It's the same people, but they seem to be doing very well economically and politically. That's an alternative model that's sitting right offshore. And then more strategically, control of Taiwan would reduce the threat from having democratic states in a position to threaten your trade and sea lanes in the event of things going south in China, politically or economically, or both. So I just threw this in. This is like a nice, it's not this is the perspective from China, and when you seen this way, you see the first island chain. It really looks like it's hemming you in, right, from the north across, and the Ryukyu Islands in particular. That's a real weak point in terms of is very vulnerable to Chinese capability. Let me come to that in a second. So what about from on the other side? How do we think about the conflict of interest there? Well, Taiwanese population has shifted in a big way towards a durable, it seems, majority against incorporation into China. U.S. administrations, to this point at least, have preferred Taiwan to stay democratic, politically and economically independent. I think that's largely, that in a big measure has just been a straight policy preference, like independent of developed arguments about how U.S. military or long-run security depends on Taiwan. I think it's just kind of it's somewhat independent of this national security concerns, but those are there too, and it's become clearer, I think, over time that there are these kind of more strictly national security implications would follow from PRC taking over Taiwan. In particular, losing Taiwan would increase China's ability to exert military and economic pressure on U.S. allies and partners in the region. And the U.S. has a huge amount of trade wrapped up and investment wrapped up in the large economies on the Pacific Rim. Japan is especially vulnerable here. I was teaching in a Stanford program in Japan last fall, and I'm now newly appreciate, or much more, the sense of threat they perceive, particularly to the islands. Like, how are they going to defend this island chain? They're worried about Okinawa if we're Taiwan to fall. So that argument about the importance of having politically and economically independent major economies in the Pacific Rim that the U.S. can continue to trade with is central in the Biden NDS, and if you look in, it's there again quite centrally in the Trump NDS. So that's an argument that's been, I don't know, it seems to have risen to the top in terms of more than you saw, I don't know, before before Xi Jinping at least. Okay. So that gives us these revisionist preferences, and we have both sides arming up, or trying to, in fact, arming up on the U.S. and allies and partner side as well. The PRC, so that they hope to be able to become so strong that they can win by making a threat, but not actually having to fight. And Taiwan, the U.S., Japan, Australia, in hopes of deterrence. So, a war would be incredibly costly and incredibly dangerous. Why not make a deal to avoid those costs in expectation? I think the key issue here is that Taiwan is hard to divide up, because it's hard to see how you could have a deal where, why not a deal where China says, we just want formal sovereignty. We'll make you a province, but we'll write a whole bunch of, we'll respect, we won't change the status quo in terms of de facto. Problem is that's just not credible at all, right? There's no way on earth that the PRC wants a province that's a lively democracy, doing its own thing with the rest of the world. And everybody knows that, and you have Hong Kong as a case in point. So that makes it essentially either it's all of Taiwan or nothing, and we have a somewhat indivisible good there. Now, arming up and arms racing doesn't necessarily lead to war. It could lead to stable deterrence. I hope it does. Or, we may find in a month that Trump decides that he doesn't care about Taiwan and it's just not worth it to him. He prefers, I don't know, some superficial trade deal or trade statements. In 2022, we saw, another element here. Putin kind of jumped through what he seems to have believed was a window of opportunity, where he thought he underestimated what turned out to be the costs and prospect for taking over Kyiv. I would say I could apply the same kind of framework, I think, to that conflict, but I think the preventive war element there is that especially since 2014, he sees Ukraine arming up, increasingly developing longer range missile capability, wants to move before it gets even stronger. There are other things going on there, but I think that's a big part of it. Something like that could happen in the Taiwan case, but hard to say. I will promote a foreign affairs piece last year that raises what I and Andrew Lim think is an underappreciated danger in terms of risk of this getting to a hot war, which is that the military postures and military operational concepts of both the PRC and the U.S. Are such that they effectively there are really large first strike advantages, which I'd be happy to talk about if anyone's interested, but it's in the article. And first strike advantages classically make crises more likely to escalate, and make kind of inadvertent escalation more likely also. Okay, so that's it. And wow, that worked out remarkably well, time-wise. U.S. and China have powerful common interests in trade and investment, and with other economies in the region. But China sees U.S. presence in the region as first of all, posing a huge barrier to seizing Taiwan, which they want for nationalist and regime security reasons. Second, they think the U.S. presence in the region provides really important support for democratic regimes and neighbors who are threatening to them as bad examples, and also possible sources or locales for coercion and influence if they have domestic trouble, and also possibly things that make domestic trouble more likely. than if they can, were the boss in the region and controlled things. And then in turn, given those things, the U.S., or at least some people in the U.S. Fear that PRC military threat to sea lanes and trade with major economies of the region. What are the takeaways for geoeconomics? I'd like to hear from you. I really don't know. Maybe it's interesting that for economists that the underlying conflict and war risk are at least I'm arguing, are conflicting preferences about nationalism and regime security, regime type, not so much I don't know, raw materials or other direct economic things, although I don't know. And I'd make that same claim about a bunch of the other conflicts, and that maybe one thing that need to think about how to incorporate here are, for example, revisionist nationalist claims. In a longer version of this, I've got a table with data on like where have most of the militarized interstate disputes been over the last 80 years, and it's just overwhelmingly cases of conflicting nationalist claims on territory. So I'll stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jim. So I think we already have several people lined up. Let me start with Elizabeth.
Thanks for an interesting presentation. So first, maybe just a quick point. I think when you look at whether China would be concerned about U.S. action in Venezuela, it's probably not about the regime change, because we didn't go in for regime change, right? And Trump has said very explicitly that we now have a non-ideological foreign policy, and so I think that means we're not interested in bringing democracy to Venezuela or Iran or anything. We're going in for different kinds of reasons. So just as the Chinese didn't like it, but I don't think that's the reason they're concerned about it. The question I want to ask you is whether, both in terms of the sort of territorial issue and also the sort of bigger picture, whether you paint a picture of China as being on the defensive, as the autocracy, but I think there's been a shift in China over the past 13 years or so since Xi Jinping came to power, where China itself is a revisionist power. It's not. It itself is trying to change facts on the ground, whether we're talking about territory, not just Taiwan, but South China Sea, et cetera, 10 different territorial conflicts. So one, are you concerned about these other territorial conflicts, especially, you mentioned the Ryukyu Islands, but, also Japan and the, not just Ryukyu, but also, the Diaoyu Senkaku Islands and, Philippines, et cetera. So one is just that element. But I think China has a bigger vision for itself, right? Reclaiming centrality on the global stage, having to do with, values and, sort of putting forth its own sense of what constitutes democracy, right? Changing international norms around technology, yes, and human rights issues. Changing, in the frontier regions, taking, Trump talked about the Arctic and, Chinese and Russian, ships. He exaggerated what's going on, but there is definitely both an economic and national security imperative in many respects, and we talked about the global financial system, but a whole array of other what Xi Jinping calls frontier regions, where China believes it can set the rules of the road. And we talked about the Belt and Road and sort of didn't get into all of the political and strategic dynamics of it. They were, I think, alluded to, but China's sort of laying stakes in other countries in ways that promote, Chinese values. So for me, I guess I see China much more proactive in terms of putting forth a vision that is revisionist to the current set of international norms and values, less so being defensive, not entirely not concerned. I don't disagree with you that is still a concern, but I think there's another side to this story, and I'm wondering how you think about that.
I don't know. I don't know. I'm not like you, a real China expert. This is a new area to me, and I'm trying to learn more. I guess, is it defensive or offensive? Yeah, I think what is it? It's like after the global financial crisis, an argument really gets going in China about like, hey, we're actually the rising power that has our act together, and I certainly see tons of evidence that they think like, yeah, we're the rising power, they're the declining power. We are clearly the declining power, and giving them every reason to think that that's exactly right. So yes, but in terms of their people usually draw a distinction between, or I often see a distinction made between, say, the Soviet Union, which had an ideology of like, communism. We want to spread this around the world, and this will be better for everybody, and this is like the way of the future and way to go. Whereas, I mean, is the Xi Jinping's idea that he wants everyone to be Chinese or be reading the great classics or something? No, it's defensive in that regard, in that it's like, why do they want lots of influence and so on? It's because that's like going to be good for Chinese businesses and also for their regime stability, right? But you're right. I haven't spent enough time thinking about the economic dimensions on the South China Sea and other territorial conflicts. I don't know. I say I don't think these are not critical for the U.S. so much as the Taiwan, where even Taiwan, it's not totally clear that you can't make an argument that U.S. national security is like, actually, you can make an argument that U.S. national security can be assured perfectly well without Taiwan being independent. But with like South China Sea, like there's absolutely no way in the current world that you can prevent China from having the ability to sink anything sailing in all these sea lanes. Militarily, the future has to be deterrence, where they can't use that, precision-guided, medium and long-range missile capability to militarily coerce us and states in the region. And the way you do that is by developing anti-access area denial environments for Japan and the Philippines and Taiwan and Australia, so that it's like, okay, you want to get something started, we can reply. So it's not, yes, they're doing these things, but we can't really do anything about that except move to a deterrence world, I would say. I don't know, I'm not sure if that answers your question, but
James?
Okay, I just want to plug Liz's essay on this topic, How China Wins the Future, February 26th issue of Foreign Affairs, for further reading.
So I had a very basic question, which is sort of, are you more or less optimistic about this argument with this president as opposed to the last one? And I suppose it goes back a little bit to Matteo's presentation, where you had this image of the hegemon either as the drug pusher, sort of trying to tempt countries into the system, or the hegemon, which is a sort of Biden vision, or the hegemon as coercer. And it strikes me that you, on the arguments that you're presenting, I mean, to put it very crudely, we know that Trump doesn't care about democracy, and therefore, is it arguable that China will perceive the risks of the sort of autocracy versus democracy as declining now that you have a president that not only doesn't talk about it, but self-evidently doesn't care about it? And on Taiwan, obviously, there is a lot on the first island chain in Taiwan that looks quite conventional in the national security strategy and the national defense strategy. But intuitionally, we think that the president doesn't care about any of this stuff anyway. Like, he doesn't care about Taiwanese democracy. He's perfectly willing to do deals. So in a sense, on the arguments that you're advancing on, do you think that in a funny way, Trump is a good thing?
No, I would not say that. But I mean, for a range of reasons, perhaps unconnected to this, but other reasons as well. I'm sure that Putin and Xi Jinping are absolutely delighted that the democracy pushing thing is gone for the moment, and that the U.S. has a leader who very, very clearly wants to be a personalist, authoritarian dictator for life. Whether he'll be able to achieve that, who knows? But they also can perceive that Trump is super erratic, and so what would should Trump being president make Xi Jinping more confident that the U.S. would not engage militarily? I don't know. I would probably turn down the expectation a little bit relative to Biden if I were Xi Jinping, but I wouldn't turn it down a lot. He's just too erratic. then in terms of actual, I mean, insofar as you can read the tea leaves, administration policy, you pointed to, so Elbridge Colby's over there, he's we've got the NDS, we've got, he gives some speeches recently, including one in South Korea, which was quite interesting. It's very much straight the Biden administration policy, Biden, and which itself was developing on first Trump administration policies in this area. Strategy of denial, first island chain, like you mentioned. There's a change in tone, and like we're going to be respectful, and we're not going to lots of words about respecting China in his speeches, but that's just like one click in this administration, and what Trump does, and I don't think that that's necessarily what other factions want. What comes out of the meeting and Trump, I don't know, it's just unpredictable. So to answer, no, I'm not that much more optimistic, because I think this administration is just it's too erratic to say like, oh, I think we've got this figured out on, especially in this part of the world. It seems like what their policy is remains pretty mysterious.
Chris?
I hesitate to jump into the debate at the risk of sounding a little like a Philistine or unsophisticated, but I mean, and kind of touching on these themes, like, how do you connect this with internal decision making in these two countries, China and the U.S., for instance? I mean, just anecdotally, I went to a talk like 5 or 6 years ago, I think, by Victor Shi, and he came in and he said, well, they decided in Washington China's the #1 threat, it's all over, and I was like, okay, this is, I was in Shanghai at the time, I was like, oh my god, my day is over, my night is over, this is terrible. But, before that, it was very much the idea of, well, it's a liberal order, China will change, we got to do our best, and now all of a sudden it's the world's #1 threat, and, is that going to continue, or is there a real tussle going on, and decision-making process here in the U.S. and what's going on in China as far as what would it take for us to achieve mutual understanding, whatever that might mean? How could we coexist without this arms race that could go off the rails?
I think as long as you have these, revisionist conflicting preferences, that's going to be tough. Now, how could you get rid of it? Well, Trump could say, I don't care about Taiwan, take it, it's fine, I'm not going to do anything. That would be a huge step, right? And so he could basically concede, right, on that very, very strong desire to change the status quo on the part of Beijing. Otherwise, I mean, he seems inclined to, or, I'm sure there's going to be some kind of announcements of we're making deals, right? You and others here would be in a much better position, I think, to estimate what's going to happen on the trade front. I really don't know.
Emily?
Thanks, this is very interesting. I had a clarification and then a question. I guess the clarification is also a question. The first, you flagged the Trump administration national defense strategy twice and said that Elbridge Colby is basically towing the line of the Biden administration.
Well, sorry, go ahead, yeah.
And okay, so number one is that correct? And two, the national security strategy does have a much bigger delta on Asia Pacific from the Biden administration. So I was wondering if you're making a deliberate choice to talk about the NDS as opposed to the NSS. So that's clarification, really. And then the second thing I just want to ask to clarify my thoughts, it was really interesting the way you said, look, the old school realists, Mearsheimer and friends, say, they have a theory that's based on this idea of the threat to your territorial integrity. Somebody will come in and invade you. And I agree with you that classically that definition of national security as territorial loss doesn't seem to apply here. God, I hope not. But is that really the right definition for one's own territorial integrity and national security strategy. I don't think that this all has to be revisionist. You want to change third countries. I think that it could be like political influence in your own country, sabotage and surveillance in your own country. So I'm not sure I would throw out the old realist yet, but please disabuse me of that notion. Thanks.
Okay, well, on that one, yes, that really is the way our thinking in my field. It would say sabotage, political influence in the other country. That's super minor stuff, and it's really, for 500 years, the standard view, which is I'd say largely correct until recently, is that for hundreds of years, what really drives international politics is the fear of being invaded and attacked by a coalition of other countries. John Mearsheimer, tries to say it's still that way and has, I don't want to get into the details of his arguments and tragedy of great power politics, but he really does try to say that, the US and China are in conflict because each one fears for its security and in a narrow sense, and that because of the dynamics of anarchy leads them to be at each other's throat. I'm trying to say, no, it's much more these days about regime security. I think it actually, in a lot of ways, this has been true in different ways back to the French Revolution. But we have it in a strong way, I'd say, over the last 20 years for reasons more specific to our time. What was the first thing you said, the first question?
Well, I was just asking why you were talking about the national defense strategy versus the national security strategy.
The national security strategy, as I recall, says stunningly little about Asia.
Correct.
It does talk about, it says, it uses the term to maintain access and freedom in the first
Yeah.
island chain.
Yeah.
That language is like dead in there. And it got slipped in there by the PACOM, or
Indo-PACOM people.
Paparo, yeah.
The NDS is I guess I wasn't trying to say any big thing there, except that the NDS does have more to say about what their ostensible defense policy is in Asia. But it also, I'd say that document shows the signs of being more than usually kludged together by different parts of the organization.
So I think we're getting to the time in the hour where I'm going to collect a few questions together and ask you to be a little bit brief in the interest of giving everybody a chance. So why don't we go Philip, Patrick, and then Steve.
So my first comment is that I agree with Jim Fearon's broad critique of the stock realist tradition's explanation. A pretty telltale sign of when you're seeing the stock realist explanation is when they fall back on analogies to 1914. And I'm actually in the process right now of reviewing a new book that will be coming out that really hits that analogy very hard, and it's somewhat misleading. That's a pretty good sign. So my second point, more importantly, is that there is a more useful analogy. And the more useful analogy is actually for Taiwan, is to the Second Berlin crisis, with Taiwan in the position that West Berlin had in the second crisis, which ran, for those of you who don't remember it very well, from late 1958 to the end of 1962, when it converged actually with what Americans think of as the missile crisis. The full dimensions of this crisis are actually not. This was the most serious crisis of the whole Cold War. Folks should understand. And American understanding, actually, of this whole crisis is not great, in part because the best work on this crisis is only published in German. So you actually have to read the German to keep track of the latest literature on it. So why is that interesting, and why do I call that out? If you analyze why did Khrushchev initiate the Second Berlin crisis in 1958, it turns out it tracks fairly well with what Jim Fearon was talking about. That is, it does not fit the narrow realist arguments well at all. He did not trigger that crisis because of anything to do with an imminent threat to invade Western Europe or seize territory. I don't think the reasons for it line up very well with Jim's two alternative explanations that he's surfacing for the modern case. But it's worth calling out that it also doesn't fit kind of that stock realist tradition, 1914 style tradition either. And then it is worth then looking at, if we're in the world of these alternative factors, you have Jim's two alternative factors. I might weight the endogenous factors somewhat more than the exogenous ones. Jim's first family was exogenous. His second family was somewhat more endogenous, and I'd weight the second family more. But the striking omission in Jim's slide, vis-a-vis Taiwan and China, is no mention of the fact that Taiwan is the hub of the ecosystem that is the fulcrum of global technological predominance in the 21st century. Well, West Berlin was not. So now add in to a situation where there's a remote analogy to West Berlin, except now the item of contest is the fulcrum of global technological dominance in this period of the 21st century. Well, by the way, that's a geoeconomic factor. So that does kind of bring geoeconomics a little bit into the conversation. And I noted that that factor figures not at all in the slides, not a phrase. I'll just say that I think it figures. I think it's figuring a lot more in the last 2 years. And I think it's a dynamic factor that has been rapidly escalating in importance in ways that we can only dimly perceive on the Chinese side. Now, why then even dwell on this history, and why bring geoeconomics into it in this way? Well, because there are two great distinctions between, say, that West Berlin analogy and Taiwan. The first great distinction is that West Berlin was not the fulcrum of the global economy. Taiwan is today. Taiwan and the ecosystem of which it is the hub, the hardware ecosystem. But the second factor is the way we defended West Berlin was in the threat to use nuclear weapons if it was threatened. A threat, by the way, of the first use of nuclear weapons, what made the situation rather inherently dangerous.
Second.
No. Our threat,
Hiroshima,
that if
Nagasaki.
they moved on West Berlin, we would escalate to nuclear war.
We would use them first.
I see what you're saying. Okay, yeah.
That is an inherently difficult threat to make. And that's one of the reasons why that crisis was so dangerous. Now, the point I'm calling out is, and what is the equivalent of that today in the defense of Taiwan? The equivalent threat of that in the case of Taiwan today, of course, is not nuclear weapon or the first use of American nuclear weapons. It is, however, a threat of economic warfare on an unprecedented scale. This is especially the case if China does not choose to launch a kinetic invasion of Taiwan. And people who are looking very hard at this actually do not believe that a kinetic invasion of Taiwan is the most likely scenario that currently threatens Taiwan. I've been part of a lot of this work as Jim and a couple of other people here now. So, therefore, you have geoeconomics as a very important part of the stakes, and you have geoeconomics actually tied up in possibly at the core of the whole strategy as to how the conflict is deterred at all. And therefore, I think we can bring geoeconomics safely into this conversation.
So AX, Steve, and Patrick, I'm gonna give you the 20 seconds rule. If you're taking more than 30 seconds to ask your question, I'm gonna cut you off because Jim needs time to reply. So give it your best shot. Patrick, you wanna go first?
How does your framework fit with the axis of autocracies where these individual nationalisms cooperate?
Where the individual nationalisms do what?
cooperate. So China cooperates with Russia, Russia cooperates with Syria, North Korea, Iran, etc. It feels like more of a club than a set of isolated autocratic states.
Steve.
I had a question related to Phillips, which was a little bit, instead of sort of military attack by China on Taiwan, what would happen if China blockades Taiwan and forces the island to concede? And then the US would have to respond to that, and if it goes military, then the US is sort of taking a very different step than sort of defending against a military attack by China. And so I was just curious how you would sort of think, I guess it ties into Philip's point, how effective could US economic warfare be in response to that? Taiwan's awfully close to China and awfully far away from the US in a very big ocean.
Ayuk.
China's strategy for moving against Taiwan is called salami slicing, or all-domain incremental pressure. The goal, of course, is to seize control of Taiwan without a fight, including seizing control of Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing base. How does that figure into your theory? Thanks.
So, Jim, given that you are an outstanding political scientist, I will give you 4 minutes to solve the Taiwan problem and also clean up a little bit of debate on the realist of the last 50 years.
No, I can't do all that even with a lot of time. But I agree with you, Phil, that I didn't mention, how important is TSMC? And this is a great, let's both turn to Matteo and say, tell us what your estimates say. There was one, I had wanted to ask you, there was a picture, it was like, where's Taiwan and the financial and the other things? It's not there. I'd be very curious to see that. The Biden folks I talked to would, say like, we really looked at this super hard, and this is an area where we actually can, it's really, really hard for China to develop these capabilities, and it's going to take decades for them to do it. And, it's not my area, and they looked at it. I find it implausible that TSMC is just like the linchpin of all future for decades forward. Other people are going to figure out how to do it, but not my area. So I didn't mention it because I could be persuaded, but my own gut on like how important Taiwan is economically is really important, but not an enduring thing. Blockade. Yeah, and I also, like Phil, would love to hear your have a longer conversation on this. I may be biased by hearing more of the kind of defense world folks, but blockade has this singular negative for China, which is that, their key military problem is how do we do this quickly so that the U.S. can't flow forces into the region and get all this stuff going, and blockade kills that. So that's part of the argument for why there can be some really big first strike advantages, is that they have the U.S. strategy is all based on, as Admiral Paparo said, blinding them in the first day, so that they can't sink our ships and we can flow forces into the region. They know that their strategy involves blinding us. So, I know serious people like Phil and Tom Christensen and others who say, oh, no, they would try blockade. I don't know.
There's another family of options other than blockade, but we
okay. Last, axis of autocracy. I'm not sure what it's an important thing, I guess. I don't see the relations we see developing, which are serious, of course, between China and Russia and Iran, as I think it's interesting. One should distinguish those from classical defensive alliances. They really are not commitments to fight with each other. They are more like, we'll help you out technologically in certain circumstances. I think that in the nuclear, I think we're just in a very, very different world from 1945 and before, where it's just much more, the problems are much more bilateral at the military level. I mean, that's a little bit too extreme, but they aren't multilateral and alliance driven the way they were in the past. But I need to think about that more. It's a good question.
Thank you. On that note, this wraps up what was an incredibly interesting and thought-provoking question and session. Thank you, Jim. We will suspend for 15 minutes, take a short break, and then at 4:30 we will have Condoleezza, HR, and Brent lead the last panel. So be back, please, in time for the last panel. Thank you.